On May 18, 1980, South Korean paratroopers entered the city of Gwangju. They were not there to defend it. They beat students with clubs. They stabbed civilians with bayonets. They fired on crowds in the streets of a city that had done nothing except protest a military coup. Over the next 10 days, an estimated 165 to 2,000 people were killed. The official count and the survivor count differ by a factor of 12, and that gap is itself part of the story. The paratroopers were following orders from General Chun Doo-hwan, the man who had seized power in a coup 8 months earlier and who needed the uprising crushed before it spread. The United States knew. American military officials in Korea had operational control over South Korean forces. The paratroopers deployed to Gwangju had been released from that joint command structure by American commanders before the operation. The U.S. did not stop it. The U.S. did not publicly condemn it. The U.S. continued to support Chun Doo-hwan. And for decades, the full extent of American knowledge and involvement was not part of the official record. This is the story of 10 days in Gwangju, and of what the city survivors have spent 45 years trying to make the world understand. To understand what happened in Gwangju, you need to understand what had happened in Seoul. On December 12, 1979, 2 months after the assassination of President Park Chung-hee, General Chun Doo-hwan staged a coup within the Korean military, arresting the acting martial law commander and seizing effective control of the armed forces. By the spring of 1980, Chun was consolidating political power and moving to extend martial law across South Korea. South Korean society pushed back. In May 1980, student protests against the extension of martial law were occurring across the country. The protests reflected genuine popular opposition, not just from students but from labor unions, religious groups, and ordinary citizens who had expected that Park Chung-hee's assassination would open the way to democratic transition, not to another military strongman. Gwangju was one of the centers of this opposition. The city in South Jeolla province had a specific history of political resistance. It was the home region of Kim Dae-jung, the democracy movement leader who would eventually become president, and its population had a particular sensitivity to the kind of authoritarian rule that Chun represented. When the protests intensified in mid-May, Gwangju's universities and streets became focal points. On May 17, Chun extended martial law nationwide and ordered the arrest of political leaders including Kim Dae-jung. On May 18, paratroopers from the 7th Airborne Special Forces Brigade arrived in Gwangju. The choice of paratroopers, special forces units known for their aggression and their training in counterinsurgency rather than crowd control, was deliberate. The paratroopers did not deploy with rubber bullets and shields. They deployed with clubs, bayonets, and live ammunition. The students who encountered them outside Cheonam National University that morning were not armed. The paratroopers beat them anyway. The violence spread from the university to the city. What happened next was not anticipated by Chun's planners. The brutality of the paratroopers, the beatings, the bayonetings, the specific savagery of special forces units deployed against unarmed civilians, did not suppress the resistance. It expanded it. Gwangju citizens, who had watched the paratroopers attack students, joined the uprising. Workers, housewives, shop owners, people who had not been at the initial protests, they came into the streets. By May 20th, approximately 100,000 people were participating in what had become a popular uprising against military rule. Citizens armed themselves. Police stations were raided for weapons. Armored vehicles were seized. The paratroopers were pushed back. For 5 days, from May 21st to May 26th, Gwangju was under citizen control. The citizens established their own security committees, their own supply networks, their own communications. The uprising had transformed from a protest into something closer to an autonomous city government functioning in the absence of the state that had attacked it. On May 27th, military forces re-entered the city. The citizen defenders at the provincial hall, the symbolic center of the uprising's resistance, were outnumbered and outgunned. They knew they would not hold. They held anyway. The last radio broadcast from the provincial hall, transmitted as the military closed in, said, "We are waiting for you, citizens of Gwangju. We will hold until the end." The military killed the defenders and retook the city. The uprising was over. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The United States military had operational awareness of what was happening in Gwangju. Under the Combined Forces command structure that governed American-Korean military operations, South Korean military units were under Joint American-Korean Command. The paratroopers deployed to Gwangju had been released from that command structure, a process that required American authorization, before the operation began. American commanders in Korea authorized the release of the units that were subsequently used to suppress the Gwangju Uprising. This is documented. American officials in Seoul monitored the situation in Gwangju throughout the 10 days of the uprising. Cables from the American embassy described what was happening, the civilian casualties, the scale of the uprising, the brutality of the military response. The cables are now declassified and publicly available. The Carter administration's response to what was happening in Gwangju was shaped by a calculation that historians have documented and debated. South Korea was a critical American ally. The American military presence in South Korea, approximately 40,000 troops, was the linchpin of the security architecture that deterred North Korean aggression. Destabilizing South Korea by publicly condemning or opposing Chun Doo-hwan's crackdown carried risks, for regional security, for the alliance, for the specific Cold War logic that made South Korea's political character less important than its strategic value. The Carter administration chose the alliance. It did not publicly condemn the Gwangju massacre. It did not use the American military's operational relationship with South Korean forces to prevent or limit what was being done to the city's population. It continued to recognize and support Chun Doo-hwan's government. Gwangju citizens, who knew that American forces were present in Korea, who knew that American commanders had authority over the military units attacking them, who in some cases went to the American consulate in Gwangju and asked for help, did not receive that help. The American consulate in Gwangju was closed on May 22, 1980. The staff was evacuated. The question of why Gwangju has not achieved the international recognition that its historical significance would seem to warrant has occupied Korean historians and activists for decades. Part of the answer is the Cold War framing that suppressed inconvenient truths about American allies. Part of the answer is the specific suppression that Chun Doo-hwan's government maintained for the years it remained in power. The story could not be fully told inside Korea until democratization created space for it. Part of the answer is something more uncomfortable, that the story of an American ally massacring its own citizens with American knowledge and tacit approval does not fit cleanly into the narrative of American foreign policy as a force for democracy and human rights in Asia. Gwangju survives in Korean memory as the foundational trauma of the democratic movement, the event that made democracy not an abstract aspiration but a blood-purchased reality. The May 18th National Cemetery in Gwangju, where the victims are buried, is one of the most visited memorial sites in South Korea. Outside Korea, the event is almost unknown. Chun Doo-hwan ruled South Korea until 1988. He governed a country in which the events of May 1980 could not be publicly discussed, in which the victims of Gwangju could not be officially mourned, in which the families of the dead could not openly identify themselves as such without risk of political persecution. South Korea's democratization, driven in significant part by the legacy of Gwangju, by a generation of activists who had been shaped by what had happened there, produced the political conditions in which the truth could finally be addressed. In 1995, the South Korean National Assembly passed legislation enabling the prosecution of coup leaders and those responsible for the Gwangju massacre. In 1996, Chun Doo-hwan was convicted of mutiny, treason, and corruption. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment. In 1997, he was pardoned, a decision that infuriated survivors and their advocates. He died in 2021 without ever formally apologizing for Gwangju. The official death toll from the Gwangju Uprising remains disputed. The South Korean government's official figure is 165 dead. Survivors, witnesses, and independent researchers have estimated figures ranging up to 2,000, a range that reflects both the difficulty of counting deaths that occurred in the chaos of 10 days of violence and the specific suppression of evidence that characterized the Chun government's management of the aftermath. The gap between 165 and 2,000 is not a statistical uncertainty. It is the distance between what the state chose to count and what actually happened. The May 18th Democratic Uprising Archive, designated a UNESCO Memory of the World Site in 2011, preserves the documentary record of the uprising, photographs, video footage, testimonies, and the specific evidence that the Chun government had attempted to suppress. The footage exists. The photographs exist. The testimonies exist. The full accounting does not. Gwangju is a city of 1.5 million people today. The streets where paratroopers beat students in May 1980 are ordinary city streets now, shops, restaurants, the ordinary daily life of a provincial capital that has rebuilt itself around and over its history. The provincial hall where the last defenders held out is still there. It is now a museum. May 18th is a national holiday in South Korea. The Gwangju Uprising is taught in South Korean schools as a foundational moment of the democratic movement, the event that demonstrated, at the cost of civilian blood, that military rule could be resisted, that the desire for democracy was real and worth dying for, and that the people who died for it deserved to be remembered. The uprising's legacy shaped the generation of activists who drove South Korea's democratization in the late 1980s. The specific knowledge that ordinary people had risen up in Gwangju, and had been killed for it, and that the state had tried to erase them, produced a political consciousness that sustained the democracy movement through years of continued authoritarian rule. What has not been fully resolved is the American dimension. The United States government has never formally addressed its role in the Gwangju massacre, the authorization of the troop release, the decision not to intervene, the cables that documented the killing without producing a response. American officials have acknowledged in general terms that the U.S. was aware of the situation. The specific questions, who authorized the troop release, what decisions were made and by whom, what the American position was in the specific hours when the crackdown was being planned, have not been answered in any official American accounting. The survivors of Gwangju, who went to the American consulate and asked for help, deserve that accounting. The consulate was closed. The staff left. The defenders at the provincial hall held until the end. The bullet marks in the walls of that building are there. They have been there for 45 years.